Hello. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction. Slight correction, I think it's about 26 books at this
Wow.
point. And I actually have a new one coming out in the UK in January, in the States in November. And it's a memoir of how I went from my previous life, not a past life, my previous life during this one when I was a musician quite some years ago in New York and Los Angeles. And then from that, how I transitioned, as people say today, from doing that to doing the sorts of things I'm doing now. So that book's called Touched by the Presence. And if you're an old Blondie fan, that's a reference to that was the band I was in the 70s. One of their songs was a hit in the UK called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear." And actually, that was my first attempt to write anything or explore anything sort of mystical or paranormal, because through a love song. It was because at the time, my girlfriend and I, when I was on tour, North American tour, and we would know when the other one was going to try to telephone, and this was long before mobile phones and things of that sort. You had to be in a phone booth or in a hotel room to make a telephone call, and we would have shared dreams and things of that sort. So the song was about that, and the title of the memoir is "Touched by the Presence." It's a reference to that. So having given my pitch, let me get my. Can I do it? Can I share? Yes. Okay. Share. Well, interesting that Elizabeth mentioned that she has some background in the fourth way and Gurdjieff, and I do as well. This was 40 plus years ago in New York first, and then in Los Angeles. The first about 81 to 85, those two places, and I might get into that during the talk. But you probably know, but this is G.I. Gurdjieff. I remember at one point not quite knowing exactly how to pronounce his name, whether it was Gurdjieff or Gurdjieff. And I remember actually Colin Wilson, the writer Colin Wilson, who's written about Gurdjieff, he once said it's Gurdjieff. So I try to repeat that whenever I have to pronounce it. And this is Ouspensky, Peter Damianovich Ouspensky, who actually was in Russia. I'll get onto this in the early 20th century. A major theosophist in the sense that he was an important member of the Theosophical Society in Russia at the time. I guess he was a journalist and a writer and wrote about mystical ideas, the fourth dimension, and things of that sort. But this is a poster for, it's an advertisement for what Gurdjieff called his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And this is for one version of the institute that he tried to get going in Tiflis, now Tbilisi, in Georgia. And this was when he and Ouspensky wasn't with him there. This is when he and his troupe, as it were, his students, were escaping a collapsing Russia. So one of the things about the story, the fourth way story, or in the early days, is that set the backdrop of the collapse of the Russian Empire, World War I, collapse of the Russian Empire, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the Civil War. And all of that commotion funnels Gurdjieff Ouspensky finally into Europe. And they enter Europe as refugees. So if you think about the people that are, the many refugees these days, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, they both entered Europe in Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul, in the early 1920s. But why it's called the Fourth Way, along with its more homely name, The Work, which we'll get onto further on. It's called the Fourth Way because Gurdjieff said that there are three traditional ways of self-development. And one is the way of the fakir, the physical way, the fellow who lies on a bed of nails, or someone who sits on a pedestal, motionless for years and things of that sort. Great command over the physical body. And anybody who spends a lot of time at the gym or yoga class, they're sort of on that path to a certain degree. And then there's the way of the monk, which is the way of developing devotion, of what's called bhakti yoga, kind of development of love, and the love for your guru, the love of God, and your devotion is developed to such an extent that just at the name of your guru or your God, you're sent into a swoon. And there's the way of the mind, dhyana, concentration, focus, meditation. It's the way of the yogi. Now, the problem with all those is that each of those can take you a certain amount of way, but it's lopsided because you're not developing the other sides. So the fakir is great command over the physical body, but has very little command over his emotions and is not particularly, intellectual. And the monk who can fall into a swoon of ecstasy over the name of his guru, has very little control of the body, and again is not particularly mentally active, let's put it that way. And then the yogi, who's very, very great control of the mind. The intellectuals, as we know, don't know what to do with their emotions, and they have a difficult time with their bodies. So each of these ways gets you some of the way towards self-development, but at the expense of others. And you could not say develop the way the fakir and then go start again as a yogi, do that and then go start again as a monk, because life isn't long enough for that. So Gurdjieff said there is another way, though, what he called the fourth way, and it's a way that combines all of these things at the same time. And that's the harmonious development. It's a system that integrates the body, the emotions, and the mind at the same time, because it has a certain knowledge of how to do that. And that tripartite sort of schema of body, mind, emotions is quite old. It goes back to Upanishads, the early Hindu sacred writings. It's in Plato, and even later, around the same time as Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, a little bit earlier, in Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And you have the three brothers, and one's the intellectual, one's the emotional, and that is a monk, and the other one is the physical one. So that's kind of why it's called the fourth way. It's also called the work, but we'll get onto that later on. So there's the basic introduction. So just to give you some of my own background, I mentioned that I was involved in this many years ago, 40 plus years ago. But in terms of my writing, I've done a biography of Ouspensky called In Search of P.D. Ouspensky. That's an allusion to his famous book, In Search of the Miraculous, which recounts his years with Gurdjieff in the early 20th century in Russia. And I wrote an introduction to Gurdjieff's, I would say, most readable of his books, the books he wrote himself, called Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is an account of his early years and his encounters with different men who he learned from and who set him on this path and things of that sort. And but it's also something that needs to be read with a certain amount of salt. How many grains you need is that you never quite know when it's factual, never quite know when it's sort of metaphoric, and so on and so on. But either way, if if you just read it for what it is, it's a very gripping, I would say, kind of adventure story to a certain degree. And more recently, I written a biography of Maurice Nicoll, who here in London, he initially was Jung's British lieutenant in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, and he actually worked with Jung in Zurich in the years just after Jung went through his crisis, the breakup with Freud. And so Nicoll had offices on consulting rooms on Harley Street, and he came from a very prestigious family. He grew up not too far from me, up in Hampstead. I'm just down the hill from him, and but he attended a lecture by Ouspensky. Actually, a friend of his, a woman who was in the Theosophical Society, told him that Ouspensky, who was in town, and he had escaped. We'll get on to how that happened, but he escaped from the refugee camp in Istanbul and found himself in London. But he was giving a talk at the Quest Society, which was G.R.S. Mead's society, and Mead was Madame Blavatsky's secretary. And he was involved with the Theosophical Society, then he broke away and started his own. But through the Theosophical grapevine, Nicoll heard about Ouspensky's lecture, and he went, and he basically changed his allegiance from Jung to first Ouspensky, then Gurdjieff. And he more or less wrote a Dear Carl letter breaking up with Jung, and Jung wasn't that happy about it. So that's my background in writing about this milieu. So who was Gurdjieff? I mean, that's or Gurdjieff. That's an interesting question. He was, as Madame Blavatsky was, a man of mystery. Well, she was a woman of mystery. A person of mystery. That doesn't sound quite as compelling. A person of mystery. But I'm not quite sure what year of his birth, and that would obviously determine how old he was when he died, but it would also determine not his ethnic background, but the nationality. So different dates: 1866, 1877. And if the first date was correct, then where he grew up, where he was born, would have been called Alexandropol, and it would have been part of the Russian Empire. But if he was born in 1877, it would have been called Gyumri and part of Armenia. And although he surfaced in Russia just before the outbreak of the First World War, Gurdjieff wasn't Russian. He was Greek and Armenian. But I have a picture of Madame Blavatsky here because there's some similarities in their style. In a certain way, you could call them trickster kind of teachers or trickster gurus. They were certainly irascible characters. And they both spent early years in search of lost knowledge, hidden knowledge. They both claim to have been taught by spiritual masters in a secret monastery. Madame Blavatsky, it's in Tibet. Gurdjieff, it's in Central Asia, where he was traveling in these years. They both wrote enormous works of esoteric literature, and I would say on the whole that Madame Blavatsky is a bit more readable, especially with the really big books. I mean, Gurdjieff's huge Beelzebub's Tales of His Grandson is quite a slog, as a friend of mine once said. It's you really need your hiking gear to a certain degree. And Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine again is another. And they both created uncomfortable situations for their students. Gurdjieff was more noted for this, and I would say he was the master of artificial crisis, or the master of purposeful inconvenience. He was able to create these very, really difficult situations and threw his students into it. But this is a poster for the film of Meetings with Remarkable Men that came out in the late 70s. And it's a film by Peter Brook. And if you know, he also did the Mahabharata, if you know that. I think a few different versions of that. I think there's an 8-hour version and maybe even longer version of that, which is the Hindu epic, part of which is the Bhagavad Gita. And one of Peter Brook, his tendency to use not professional actors sometimes works, sometimes does it. I find the film a bit tedious, but there's two bits when it comes on. For me, is one is when the late Terence Stamp, who just passed away, he has a part in it, and when they have a performance of the Gurdjieff movement, so the sacred dances. This is supposed to be taking place in the Sarmung Brotherhood, which is the monastery of the secret society that Gurdjieff found. And in my own involvement, when I was involved in New York in the early 1980s, the group leader, someone named Paul Reynard, he died some years ago, but he was one of the principal teachers of the dances. And he's actually in the film. I think it's on YouTube. So you can probably catch it. But if you've never seen them, they're quite remarkable. I don't want to pretend to do. I mean, I have practiced them many, 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 many years ago, but they are quite remarkable. And let me just a second here. Hold on a second. That's not what I wanted to do. Oh yes, and that's over there. We have the image of the Enneagram, and this was a symbol that Gurdjieff learned about during his time in the Saarmung Brotherhood. It's a nine-pointed symbol, and it's supposed to incorporate two of the it's two sort of basic cosmic laws. Gurdjieff's system is a psychological aspect to it, and there's a cosmological aspect to it, and they're interconnected. And I would say the main kind of notion of sort of laws operating in the universe that one has to learn how to work with and accommodate. There's law of three and law of seven. The law of three, actually, in a way, it goes back to the gunas, if you know Hindu philosophy, tajas, rajas, and tapas. And it's the three different forces. And Gurdjieff basically says for any phenomena to take place, for anything to actually take place, three forces are required. And he would say, like, in the West, we only know positive, negative, but there's something else. There's a third force that reconciles the two together. So in a way, it isn't that different from, say, if you know your German philosophy, Hegel's dialectic, where there's thesis and antithesis, and they kind of combine it and they produce something else. And Jung had another similar idea, if you know what he calls the transcendent function, in the sense where two oppositions, if you find yourself confronted with a situation that it seems impossible, like there's just whatever irreconcilable force and an immovable object. So you're in some sort of situation where those two forces are at work, and then somehow the friction and the tension between those two produces a third that liberates you from it. So again, not to take away from Gurdjieff's uniqueness, some of the ideas have similar kind of resonances in other systems. But I forgot the law of seven. The law of seven, the other major one, is basically it's based on the octave do re mi, and again, Gurdjieff says all phenomena, all processes take place in this kind of 7-step sort of thing, and there are certain parts of it, there's certain times in the process, and as in sort of the octave where you don't have a whole note in between some notes, it's like a half note, something like that. And what he says, when those sort of things take place in human events or in one's own psychological processes and development, it needs a shock. It needs something to come in to keep the process going in the direction it started in, because if it doesn't get that, it will eventually turn around and become its opposite. And again, this is something, Jung talks about this when he refers to the Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, this notion of enotiodromia, where something will turn into its opposite. So the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity turns into the reign of terror, and in Gurdjieff's own time, the Bolshevik Revolution, which is supposed to be, freedom for, the working class and all that, it turns into its own terror as well. So there's tendency for processes to turn into their opposite unless they are guided along by this shock that one has to supply at different times. Okay, so all this kind of is taking place. Gurdjieff is in Russia. He's holding classes in St. Petersburg, and meetings St. Petersburg and Moscow, but he's not really that well known. And he steps into history when he meets, or rather than Ouspensky is ensnared to meet him in about 1915, just as not long after the Guns of August take place, famously 1914. That's August. That's when World War I starts. So, which I'll get onto, but Ouspensky himself, I said he was a known theosophist. He was a known writer. He wrote about the fourth dimension. He wrote about time. He wrote about tarot, things of that sort. And he was a figure in this time that was known as the Silver Age, which is about 1890 to about just before the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, 19, what was that, 16 or 17, 17 takes, ends it. And again, I've written about this time as well, the return of Holy Russia. The reason I wrote this is because this fellow here, down here, Tsar Vladimir, in an attempt to gain a new identity for Russia post the collapse of the Soviet Union and the free fall that happened in the 90s, he started referring to this time, the Silver Age, and he started referring to figures from pre-Bolsheviks. One of them is Nikolai Berdyaev, who's a Christian existentialist philosopher. There was Vladimir Soloviev. He's considered Russia's first philosopher. It was a time of a great efflorescence of interest in spirituality and in mysticism and religion, in magic and things of that sort, theosophy. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy was very, very popular there. Madame Blavatsky, strangely enough, although she was Russian, the theosophy wasn't as popular in Russia because she was very critical of Christianity, and she was more geared towards the Eastern. Steiner, if you know Steiner, he does a kind of Christian theosophy in a certain way. He adapted many of the theosophical kind of themes and schemes and ideas and into his own blend of sort of Christianity and sort of German idealist philosophy. But he was very, very popular in Russia at this time. There were many, many, many anthroposophical groups there and all that. So Ouspensky was around in this time. I mean, the figure that we know sort of from a lot of movies and books, and most of the stuff we're told about him is inaccurate, is Rasputin, the holy devil. But the notion of the holy devil it gives you an idea what the time was like. It was like a blending of opposites. In many ways, much like sort of the heyday of the 1960s in America and here, when you had a great resurgence of interest in magic and things of that sort. So all this is happening in that period, and as I said, Ouspensky was very well known. This is in Russian, an edition of his book about the fourth dimension. This is his book about the symbolism of the tarot, and it's these very moving sort of prose poems, little poetic descriptions and kind of interpretations of the tarot, of the trumps. And but he was a familiar figure at a place in St. Petersburg called the Stray Dog Cafe. And I should point out one of the things about Ouspensky is that because he wrote about the fourth dimension, in some of the early books that translated into English, on the book jacket, they said he was a mathematician. He never was a mathematician. He was a dropout. Actually, was like a high school, college dropout. But he was more of a poet and a poetic kind of thinker than a mathematician. But that because of a mistake, they sort of he got characterized as that. So this other poetic side of him doesn't come out that much. In my book about him, I try to bring that out. But this is a very famous bohemian hangout watering hole, St. Petersburg. Anna Akhmatova, the poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Vladimir Klebnikov, Osip Mandelstam, many, many others who would fall foul of the coming regime, the coming Bolshevik regime. Although Mayakovsky was a poet of the revolution, he wound up blowing his brains out because he couldn't find a place for himself in it. But how Ouspensky meets Gurdjieff, or is ensnared and actually compelled to meet Gurdjieff, it's at the tail end of his search for the miraculous. And this is the name of the book about his time with Gurdjieff, but in another book called New Model of the Universe, which came out in the 1930s here, there's a chapter in there called In Search of the Miraculous. And this was about, he was commissioned by several newspapers in Russia to go to the East at a time when travel was, very strange, not like now. You just get a bit, backpack and zoom, you're in, wherever it is. It was very, difficult and all that. And he went to all places, like he was in Ceylon, Egypt, Taj Mahal, in Constantinople, when it was still Constantinople. Ataturk hadn't come to power yet, and he spent time with the dervishes and the Sufis. He also wrote about the miraculous in Europe. He wrote a lovely, lovely short sketch of Notre Dame, and how he talked about going up to the top of the towers here and looking out of, and he talks about the history of crime. This is his kind of notion of, like, all of human history is the history of crime, it's the history of kind of violence and lies and things of that sort. And he's looking for a way out of all of that. He's looking for some way that will take him beyond that into, the world of, truth and beauty and all that sort of thing. And he goes on this search because he thinks he can't find anything in Europe. He can't find anything in Russia. He's done many, many experiments himself, with changing his consciousness through a variety of different things, yogic techniques. He experimented with nitrous oxide after reading William James's accounts of that, many hypnosis, dreams, many, many other things. But he has the idea that somewhere in the East, there are schools where there are methods, verifiable, empirical, verifiable methods to, achieve this alteration of consciousness. So he goes in search of these, but he doesn't find them. And down here, he even goes, he's in India, and he goes to the theosophical headquarters in Adyar. And he tells the story of when he was there. And it was there were like 3 tiers, I think, in the building itself. I'm not quite sure exactly how it was done, but he like the ground floor was for the rank and file theosophists, and the second story was for the wealthy patrons, but the third was for prestigious, important visitors. And Ouspensky liked to tell the story that he was taken immediately up there, where he met Annie Besant and so on and so on. So he was, as I said, he was considered a well-known theosophist, but he didn't find what he was looking for. So he comes back to Russia, and he talks about how, as he landed, as he or came back into Moscow, St. Petersburg, he hears that war had broken out. The great war that he knew would happen, but he did not want to accept, the reality was going to take place and all that. And he's disillusioned from his search. And he is, here's the war, here's the Nevsky, I think that's the Nevsky Prospect, I'm not quite sure. That's the war. And he's a journalist, so he's writing a column for one of the papers. And in another paper, he sees an advertisement for this ballet called The Struggle of the Magicians. And it strikes him as interesting. He doesn't know anything about it. He doesn't know anything about Gurdjieff, anything like that. This is a ballet that Gurdjieff, whether it was actually ever performed in toto, the whole thing, or not, scenes from it have been over the years. I haven't kept up with it, so maybe there has been a complete performance of it. But it's one of these things that he advertises as happening, but does it ever really happen? Ever happen? It's one of these strange kind of tricks that Gurdjieff kind of plays. And Ouspensky sees this ad and he thinks, oh yes. So he puts a notice of the ballet in this column he's writing. And he says something like, well, it'll probably contain all of the mystical tricks that one goes to India to find and never does, or something like that. So he's a bit, he's had it for gurus. He's not interested in gurus, anything like that. But what happens is that at one of his talks, where he's talking about his travels, he's talking about being the Taj Mahal and Ceylon and all that, and his search to big audiences in big halls, 1,000 people and things like that. 2 of Gurdjieff's students start talking to him and say, you must come and meet this Mr. G. There's a certain Mr. G that they insist that he meets. And Ouspensky's like, basically, I've just come back from this, journey in the East. I've had it with gurus. I'm not particularly interested. But they insist and insist and insist. And finally, he agrees. And he meets Gurdjieff. So he went in search of the miraculous, right? The miraculous went out looking for him and found him not in an ashram, not in a temple, not in front of the Sphinx, but in a cheap cafe in a back street in Moscow, just as World War I is breaking out. And he meets Gurdjieff, and one of the strange things is that Gurdjieff, I mean, I should say it's funny because it really reads like this must have been quite a strange thing. So he meets him, and he's immediately impressed by him, but he also thinks he's a man in disguise, but it's a very poor disguise, and it's a disguise that's so bad that he would know that I know he's in disguise. So it's as if, you were sitting across from somebody, you're just meeting them, and say you had those old-fashioned glasses with the nose and the mustache on, and you were sitting there, and you had that, and you were just talking normally, as if nothing, was strange. And the other person is looking at you like, well, why is he? So immediately, the kind of psychodrama, the kind of psychological game playing that Gurdjieff is very, very good at and well known for starts taking place. And he starts talking Ouspensky, and he said, "Yes, I sent my students to meet you. We read your books. We read your accounts in the newspapers about your travels and all that. I traveled too." And he starts telling about his travels and all this kind of stuff. And Ouspensky's completely hooked. He's immediately hooked and caught up. And after talking about many, many, many different things, the travels, where he's been, the effects of drugs and hypnotism, and Gurdjieff practiced as a hypnotist for many years. He starts to say what his kind of philosophy is, or what his take on things is. And he basically says that, everyone that everyone you're ever going to know is a machine. This is something I just picked up off the net, the human, the mechanical human, some wrote from whenever that was. But everyone is a machine. Everyone thinks they have free will. Everyone thinks they're making their own decisions, but actually, we're all motivated by exterior forces impinging on us and sort of basically pushing us around to do things. And Ouspensky's like, well, I agree that's in many aspects of life are like that, and and he's philosophical about it, but he say, but not art and not philosophy. These things, no. That's an artist is just as mechanical as someone driving a bus, and the philosopher, oh, he's even more mechanical. The philosopher, because he lives in his head and he's away from reality and all this. And Ouspensky's like, he resists, but after a while, he starts to understand what Gurdjieff's saying. And there's a famous scene in the book where he sees a lorry go by, and it has stacks and stacks and stacks of crutches. And he realizes these are crutches for legs that have not yet been blown off. Right? Everyone's on their way to the war, and so we're preparing for X number of legs to be blown off. And he just said, well, like, yes, it's right in front of me how mechanical we are and things of that sort. So he's quite taken with Gurdjieff, and he agrees to become a student. I can't go into the detail, but the book, if you ever get a chance, In Search of Miraculous, it's the best introduction to Gurdjieff's system, at least in the way that he taught it to Ouspensky. But it's also this kind of adventure story of taking place, the backdrop of the collapse of Russia and all of that history happening. So he goes and he spends, quite a bit of time. Classes in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Gurdjieff pulls this sort of thing where he never tells anybody until the last minute whether there's going to be a meeting or not. And Ouspensky has to round everybody up. And again, you have to remember, practically the telephone was around. There was nothing like that. So you usually have to run around to somebody's house and knock on the door and ask them if they want to come to the meeting. So again, this was this way of making things difficult. Gurdjieff said, if people only value what's hard, what they have to work for, or what they have to pay for. If it's free, if it's easy, they don't value it very much. So he created a kind of aura of importance, by making it these difficulties and things like that. But eventually there's a band of them, and there's a remarkable account just before the end where I think it's in Finland, where they've rented a house and they do this intensive kind of work. The thing I forgot, one of the parts of Gurdjieff's, it's interesting that I forgot to do this because it's about remembering. One of the things that really captured Ouspensky's attention was Gurdjieff said, he talked about what he called self-remembering. which is a state of consciousness that we experience intermittently flashes of, where we're very aware of our own being, we're aware of our own existence. Most of the time, we're aware of outside, or we're submerged in our kind of thoughts and preoccupations. But there are moments when we suddenly realize that we are here now in this actual world that we're in. And it could happen. It happens under times of danger or crises. And that's why Gurdjieff in many ways creates kind of artificial crisis and artificial inconvenience to shock people into this wakefulness. Or it can happen when you travel and you find yourself in a strange place you've never been before, and you have that feeling like, oh, me here? What am I doing here? Kind of, so you have most of the time, we're just so familiar to everything around us that we take our existence for granted, and it doesn't strike us as the strange mystery and miracle that it is. And so self-remembering. And the way that he talks about it in the book is that if you have to take an old-fashioned pocket watch, but you could do practically anything. But the pocket watch works because the second hand goes around. And the idea was to look at the watch. You can't do it with a digital one. So look at the watch and pay attention to the second hand go around, but at the same time, paying attention to your awareness that it's you looking at it. And what would happen is that you would either fall into just paying attention to the watch, or you would go back to your thinking, in your subjective world. But occasionally there would be a moment when the two would become one in a way, and that would be self-remembering. So this is one of the things that, because Ouspensky he was a philosopher of consciousness, and he was a keen observer of his own, and he recognized this was something very, very new. So I'm putting lots of stuff together really quickly just to kind of tell you the story. But what happens, as I said, the collapse of Russia, the Civil War, and all that throws them across Russia, the continent, and they wind up in Constantinople or Istanbul. And Ouspensky there is teaching English in a refugee camp to fellow Russians. So this is the time of all the white Russians, and there's like the counts and countesses and princes that were no longer anything because the Bolsheviks have done away with all of that. And so they're flooding into Europe. And if you know these movies from the 30s, some of these comedies, there's like a count or something like sweeping, the hotel floor or something. He used to be a count in Russia, but now he's getting whatever work he can get. So that's the kind of context that Ouspensky and Gurdjieff was in. But Ouspensky, again, the miraculous comes to him again, in the sense that this book of his called Tertium Organum, the third organ of thought. A fellow Russian who was in the States already, he took it to what's his name? Sorry, I'm just going to get slipped now. Claude Bragdon. Again, he's a theosophist in America, and it was someone who wrote about higher space and higher dimensions, the fourth dimension, and things of that sort. This was a craze at the time, similar to like what chaos theory was, or entanglement is today, quantum entanglement. So higher dimensions. So we're aware of three dimensions of space, one dimension of time, but there's higher kinds of dimensions. So Ouspensky's book is about that, and has a lot of theosophical ideas in it as well. And this Russian brings a copy to him because Claude Bragdon can read Russian. He translates it, and it becomes a surprise bestseller. It sells thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. But no one knows where Ouspensky is. And it was, again, through a chance encounter with someone at, I think, a theosophical center, that word got around that he was in this refugee camp in Istanbul. And so Bragdon sends him a much needed royalty check, quite a bit of money. And he wants to get out of where he is, obviously. And another miracle is that one of the readers of this book, Tertium Organum, is a woman named Lady Rothermere, who was the wife of the newspaper baron, who, like, I think it was the Daily Mail or something like that back then in the 20s, 100 years ago, a little bit less than that. I'm sorry, a little bit more than that. And she's a reader of this. And so she finds out where Ouspensky is, and she says, I must meet you. Money, no object, London, New York. So she's willing to pay for him to get out of Istanbul to come to London. But he needs to get a visa. And then by chance, and the Home Office don't want to let him in because he's Russian. Even though he's a vehement anti-communist, he's a vehement anti-Bolshevik. He didn't like the Tsar, but he really hates the commies, as it were. And he's finding it difficult to get the visa. And then a fellow named J.G. Bennett, who later becomes a big name in the work and has his own school in Sherborne. Robert Fripp, the guitarist from King Crimson, was one of his students. He meets Ouspensky just by chance. And he also meets Gurdjieff at the same time, but he doesn't know that they're connected. And he secures a visa for him. So Ouspensky comes to London, and Lady Rothermere, who had a salon in Circus Road over in St. John's Wood, not far from where I live, she invites T.S. Eliot and Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd, and again Maurice Nicoll, who at the time was a Jungian psychiatrist who was well known, and many other figures. And Ouspensky suddenly, from living in this refugee camp and earning tiny bit of money by teaching bad English to other Russians, he's intellectual flavor of the month. He's here in London, and but what he talks to them about is not this. He talks to them about Gurdjieff's system. So he doesn't talk to them about his best-selling book. He puts that behind him, and he talks to them about Gurdjieff's system. Okay, so Ouspensky sets up classes there, and people are coming. I mentioned Maurice Nicoll. Some of the people to go, a fellow named A.R. Oraj, who was at the time the editor of a journal called The New Age, and nothing to do with 70s, 80s notion of the New Age. There was an intellectual literary journal. People like Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, and others contributed to it. But he was one of the people interested. He went to Ouspensky's lectures, and I said Maurice Nicoll and others. And Gurdjieff too has found himself out of this. They separated. They worked together. But at a certain point, Ouspensky thought that Gurdjieff was moving in a direction that he didn't want to go in, and he had his own ideas about things. So even though he taught the system, it was. And he always said, this is not my work. This is not my ideas. This is a system that Gurdjieff said he got from the Sarmong Brotherhood and all that. He taught that. He kept the distance from Gurdjieff, although he helped him along the way. So he wanted to establish himself as an independent teacher, not to be Gurdjieff's student, just working with him. He wanted to establish himself as an independent teacher. And this starts the rift between them. And when Gurdjieff has tried to get this Institute for Harmonious Development going. He first, I said, he tried to get it in Tiflis, then he's in Constantinople. He tries kind of to get it going in Constantinople, but doesn't really. Next was in Berlin. He tried to get it going there. And Germany, that didn't work. And then finally he comes to England and he tries to set it up here. But the Home Office really don't like him because as Madame Blavatsky did, there was all this suspicion that couldn't they be a Russian spy? And there is evidence that at a certain time in his early career, Gurdjieff did do these kind of political missions, but in a sense that it took him to places he wanted to go. So he wanted to travel in the Holy Land, or he wanted to travel in Central Asia, or along those lines. And so sort of like political missions of different kinds he would take on and go do in order to be in those places. So it was kind of if he was a spy, it was out of convenience for himself. So it was kind of, espionage of convenience. But finally, he manages to get a place in Fontainebleau, which is outside of Paris. And in 1983, I visited the site of the Institute for Harmonious Development of Man, which he did open there in 1923. I get my dates correctly. And he comes to London, and this is the first time older people meet him. That Ouspensky's collected all of his students, and he's talked to them about him and talked about the system and all that. But this is the first time, Gurdjieff himself arrives, and he's just kind of, it's very, very powerful. Jung would say he had a lot of mana, just like really powerful, charismatic, heavy gravitas. And there's a whole story where at the first kind of meeting, he didn't say anything, and everyone was too timid to, ask a question. And one of the main themes in the work is the difference between essence and personality, which I can only do quickly. Personality is who we are, me talking right now. And I've acquired this over the years. Essence is something you're born with, and it's your real self, but it it's soon covered over by personality, and it doesn't have a chance to grow and express itself. And someone finally asked Gurdjieff, it said, what would it be like to see things, see the world through essence? And he said, everything more vivid. So it was, and again, in some of my books and other things, I relate that to all this talk, the ideas about the difference between left and right brain and all that. I can't go into this now. But he opens this institute outside of Paris in this old chateau that's completely run down. But that's exactly what he wants to do. He wants a place where the students, they have to do physical labor. This is why it comes to called the work. It comes to be called the work because it's actually physical labor. So people are chopping wood, they're tilling fields, they're dealing with livestock, they're putting up fences, they build a study hall out of an old, like a disused airplane hangar, after World War One. Gurdjieff was one of the most resourceful people ever. He was able not only to survive, he prospered under very, very difficult conditions. And if there's anything he needed, he managed to get it. And also at the same time that he was running this institute and doing this esoteric stuff, he was running lots of businesses in Paris. He was always very good at making money. There was some remarkable ability to be able to, turn over quick, exchange of money from buying a business, getting it going, and selling it, and things of that sort. But I mentioned the movements, and one of the things that sets apart Gurdjieff's way of doing this, the fourth way, and Ouspensky's, was that he developed these sacred dances, the movements. Ouspensky didn't really do that. He wasn't a physical type. He was more the yogi. Gurdjieff, I would say, was not exactly fake here, but kind of like that. He was very physical, but he also had this great kind of mana, this like a energy in him. But these movements, it's, if you know the old thing of like, patting your head and rubbing your stomach, it's like 10 times that. Your hand's doing something, your foot's doing something, your head's doing something, you're moving, there's some music behind you constantly. And I remember, again, years ago, when I was doing this, being taught like some new series of these things was incredibly difficult. And I at one point I said, I just can't do it. But I tried one more time, and then bang, I got it. And as soon as I got it, I got this whole influx of energy. And let me see if I can find what, because oh yeah, that's never mind. Now I see who that is. Okay. So he's able to, if you know the notion of second wind, like athletes, when they're running a marathon, they feel like they run out of juice, they can't go anymore, and then they one more time they push a little bit more, and then suddenly there's a new petrol tank opens up. So somehow Gurdjieff was able to create that. He was able to create conditions where purposely inducing second wind. That's how I understand it. But one of the many people came there, but one of the more famous people who came there was the writer. God, my brain going. Sorry, this is the New Zealand writer who Catherine Manfield. Sorry, she was a friend of A.R. Oraj, who was this editor of the New Age magazine, and she was dying of tuberculosis actually, and she had heard about Gurdjieff and what a remarkable character he was and all that, and the Prairie, the institute, and she thought that somehow he could help her. So she wound up going there, but he couldn't help her. He tried to create conditions and environment that may have prolonged her life some. But she did wind up dying there from tuberculosis. So that gave kind of his institute a bad name. That was interpreted as that, this guru, Svengali kind of character. She fell under his spell, and see what happened, that kind of thing. But she was already sick, and she went there hoping that he was able to help her. But the institute does not last very long. Little a little more than a year passes after its opening, and then he closes it down. He keeps the Prairie, he keeps the chateau, but the actual institute itself, he no longer has it. And we're not quite sure why he does that. But one of the things that happens is Gurdjieff has a really terrific car accident. He was a horrible driver. He was notoriously known as like you were taking your life in your hands if you got in the car with him, and that was one of the tests sometimes. So he would like come for a drive, and he would give you the shock of your life and all that. He certainly felt more awake after that. But one time he told his secretary, who usually drove back, because he would go into Paris to deal with these businesses, and he told the secretary, "No, you take the train back today." And she was, why, that's strange. And then before driving into Paris, he had the car, everything on the car checked. He had the steering, the wheels, everything gone over, had a MOT, total, and all that. And he winds up that's not the actual, that's not the actual car there, but he winds up crashing into this tree on the road from Paris to Fontainebleau. And he's found laid out with one of the cushions from the car under his head and lying, like resting. And how he got in that position, no one knows. His hands are all lacerated, his face is lacerated. He had very, 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 very severe injuries. He was wrapped, bandages over his head for months and things of that sort. But some people thought he had the accident on purpose. Had the accident on purpose for one, to give him a reason to close down the institute. He got out of it what he wanted, I think, and he got rid of lots of people he didn't want. And even at the time, I'm skating over this stuff so quickly. Even at the time, what the people did there, all the building they did, all the time they were trying to self-remember and work on themselves, not to express negative emotions, thinking about the law of three, law of seven, incorporating all of these cosmological and psychological ideas at the time they're doing all this physical labor. And it's remarkable what they do, what they achieve. But even then, he tells one, it's a strange thing. He tells Maurice Nicoll, like, all this won't be here. This is all temporary. Soon everyone will be someplace else. But then he told J.G. Bennett, who winds up there, who he met in Constantinople and comes around, he tells him his plans for building an observatory and some other grandiose kinds of things. So he's telling one student everything's temporary, and he's telling the other one he has plans for some, observatory to build there. So again, it's this kind of, you're not quite sure. Was there ever really an institute? People there, it was like Alice in Wonderland, and actually in there. In my book about Maurice Nicoll, because he spent time there, I've extended account of his experience there. And but like when Orage went, he was given a shovel, and he was forbidden to smoke. He was chain smoker, and he was forbidden to read, and he was given a shovel and told to dig. And every day he would dig, and then he was told to fill the hole again. So he would dig and dig and dig until he was aching and sweating and fill the hole again. And he thought, what have I got myself into? But in the same way of experiencing doing those movements and hitting into second wind, one day when he said he was absolutely nauseated by doing this digging, he said, okay, this is it. This is the last day. I'm not going to do it. Then he does it, and then bang, that extra energy, what Gurdjieff called the accumulator, kicked in. And Gurdjieff, Orage was digging, and he enjoyed it. He was like, it was remarkable. So people found themselves in this crazy kind of situation in this institute. But after a year, it was it was over. Gurdjieff sends Orage to New York because he's thinking of going there, and he's bringing his troupe of dancers there, and they give performances in New York and Chicago and some other places. But he's also spending his days in Paris after he's recovered from the accident, writing this gigantic work called Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. And it's one of the most difficult books to read. It's like it's a series of parenthetical remarks and neologisms, and it's kind of a gigantic shaggy dog story in one sense, the way Gurdjieff writes it. So, but Beelzebub is named for the devil, but it's also this higher being, and he's flying through space in his spaceship Karnak, and he basically is telling his grandson what's wrong with the Earth. What's wrong with human beings on Earth, and it's just an extended critique of basically Western life, Western civilization, and all that. But he's developing in that a whole different system or way of teaching than he taught Ouspensky. So that's one of the splits too. There's a famous story where one of Gurdjieff's students who knew Ouspensky as well gave him a copy of this book, and Ouspensky couldn't read it. He said he just started to read it, and he just couldn't. He couldn't. It sticks in his throat. He said he couldn't read it. And oddly enough, there was another work that came out a bit later in the 30s called Herald of Coming Good, which is like, I don't know. It's like he withdrew it. It is actually quite a strange work. I mean, this is a strange work, but there's some notion that you're getting at something. This other one was just a kind of megalomaniacal kind of text, and it's quite strange. Ouspensky, when he read it, he thought that Gurdjieff had basically gone, out of his mind. So at the time when they've split up, Gurdjieff is in New York, um, living in hotels, and Orage is there drumming up money for him and introducing him to famous intellectuals in New York and things of that sort. Ouspensky sat out the 1920s, and in the early 30s, he starts to come out on his own again. He spends 1920s in the bedsit, like in Baron's Court, writing this book, In Search of the Miraculous. But then in the early 30s, he decides to put together the book that he was working on before he met Gurdjieff, that he stopped work on after he met Gurdjieff. So he's gone back to it. It's called The New Model of the Universe. And it's a wonderful collection of chapters about different things: dreams, hypnotism, Superman, eternal recurrence, the new physics at the time. It's not quantum, so it's kind of passe in that realm. The fourth dimension, the tarot. It has this chapter about his journey in the search of miraculous and all that. And he starts, coming out, and he there's he starts getting more and more students, so he feels he needs to set up a bigger kind of thing. They're holding classes and meetings just in rooms in London. First, he has a place in Kent, but then in the end, he gets a place called Lyme Place in Virginia Water, which is about 20 miles outside of London. And he sets up his own institute there. He doesn't call it that, but he's kind of, that's what he's doing there. And some of the people who come, there's Ouspensky on his horse, Jingles, that he rode around the estate on. But some of the people going there, J.G. Bennett becomes one of his students. There's Maurice Nicoll again. A writer who was very influenced and very interested in Ouspensky was J.B. Priestley. And he's not as well known these days, but in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, he was one of the most popular and successful British writers. His plays like Time in the Conway or I Have Been Here Before, they use Ouspensky's time theories. And Ouspensky had a pet theory that he called eternal recurrence. And it's, if you think of it as reincarnation, right back into who you are. You don't reincarnate into a different person. You're not reborn into a different personality, a different time, different place, different family. Your whole life just starts over again. The same thing over. If you remember that film Groundhog Day, which was one day going over and over again. So Ouspensky, your life would go over again. But if you become conscious, if you work on yourself, you get different, ways of becoming aware of the recurrence, and what he calls different crossroads. You can make a different decision, and you can eventually get off that wheel of recurrence and go up to a higher dimension. So this is one of the pet theories of his, and Priestley was very, very interested in that and used that. And so the people closest to Ouspensky, another visitor at Lyme Place was Aldous Huxley, who went there with Gerald Hurd just before they left England to go to America, because they knew the war was coming. They were very aware of what was happening in Europe, so they knew the war was coming. And Ouspensky would do the same. But this fellow here, Rodney Collin, he became kind of Ouspensky's kind of second in command in a certain way. He very devoted student to him, and he would stay with him more or less for the rest of his life when Ouspensky goes to America himself. But Gurdjieff's in America, and his fortunes are up and down. Ouspensky tends to doing fairly well all the time. Gurdjieff is always up and down, out of money. There's Orage again drumming up money for him. This is when he's in New York. He's giving performances of the movements. He's holding meetings, and there used to be a chain of restaurants on the East Coast of America called Child's Restaurants. He would kind of sit. In Paris, that was like the style. In the old Paris, you could sit at a cafe practically all day, nurse two coffees, and you could write a book there. You could have a philosophy class or something like that. America, they didn't have the cafes, but they had these big, huge kind of coffee shops or diners. And Gurdjieff would stay at one. He would plant himself at one of these in New York, wherever it was, 6th Avenue, 42nd Street, whatever, and people would come to see him there. And some of the people that he meets at this time and become involved with, one is Gene Toomer, who was famous for his first novel, Cain, and he was African-American author, and he became very interested in Gurdjieff and wound up sort of trying to become a teacher himself. Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, who never became a student of Gurdjieff, but they had a kind of friendly bro rivalry, guru kind of rivalry. But he marries Olga Vana, was one of the women who's one of the principal dancers. She might even be in this photo here. Frank Lloyd Wright marries one of Gurdjieff's students. And this fellow here, his name is Ram Landau. And he's not a name people know now, but in the 30s and 40s, he was a best-selling writer, and he wrote about kind of spirituality and what we would call mind, body, spirit. And he did a book called God is My Adventure. And he has this chapter on Rudolf Steiner, I think Krishnamurti, there's one on Ouspensky, there's one on Gurdjieff, but separately. And one gets the impression that for some reason, Gurdjieff didn't like him. And there's a whole, he meets him in one of these hotel rooms where Gurdjieff's living. And Gurdjieff, again, was a chain smoker, and he vodka around all the time and all this kind of stuff. And it was like a kind of unseemly atmosphere Landau encountered. And Gurdjieff is just being very evasive, and he's kind of pretending that he doesn't understand what he's saying and all this. So it's one of these psychodrama moments where for some reason Gurdjieff wants to give Ram Landau a bad impression, and he succeeds. And so he writes about him in this book. But war breaks out. Gurdjieff goes back in France. He has to finally give up the Prairie. He has to move into Paris. He gets a small flat in the Rue des Colonels Reynard, which is near the Étoile. And 1940, after the phony wall, France falls, and Hitler is occupying, or the Nazis are occupying Paris. And at this time, Gurdjieff keeps up his classes, and the way that he was doing it then is that he would in this small flat, he would gather students, many as they could come, and they would go there. And he was somehow able to get everything he needed to, at a time it was very difficult to get lots of things there during the occupation, to create these huge, sumptuous meals, Eastern style, And this is something he would carry on throughout the time that he was living in Paris there. He would cram as many people he could into these rooms. They would have this meal, and then they would have what he called the toasts to the idiots. And people would have to knock back several shots of vodka. And what that did is that relaxed your personality, and your essence came out. And then Gurdjieff was able to, what he would say, see you. He would be able to see you, and he would give you a nickname, or say something about, or there were different ranks of idiots. There were different kinds of idiots. And if you remember, when we say idiot, we mean somebody who's stupid and crazy, but it actually means unique in the sense of idiosyncratic. It's unique to you. That's very idiosyncratic of him. Whatever, you know what I mean? So that's what the original meaning of the word idiot meant. So he's talking about this certain kind of uniqueness. So there's you are this kind of idiot, and he tells you that, and then you have that to work on yourself. So different ways of working on yourself. But some of the people to come, there was a whole group of women writers who gathered and met with him. They were called the Rope, and Salita Solana, Enrico Caruso's wife, Margaret Anderson, and many others from sort of the cultural literary world at the time would meet with him. And some of them had lesbian relationships. Others, I don't know too much about them, but this was like a particular group that he met at the time. Other people came, was René Daumal, who was kind of a surrealist poet at the time. He had started his own kind of movement. He became a student of Gurdjieff because he met Alexander de Salzman, who was one of Gurdjieff's followers that Gurdjieff had met in Tiflis, and he had followed him throughout his different career from there. And there is, again, Gurdjieff always had the situation he would break with his students in a very rough kind of way. Um, there was a kind of way where everything would be difficult, and then he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't talk to you. You get that kind of thing. So there was a situation between the Salzman and Gurdjieff where that had happened. But the Salzman was a remarkable artist, had his fingers in many different pies. He was a painter, he was a draftsman, he was a set designer. He knew jujitsu, things of that sort. So he was a remarkable man in himself, and Damal became a student of him. Damal eventually died of tuberculosis in Paris during the occupation. This is Jacques Bergier, who wrote a very co-author. No, I'm sorry. This is Louis Paul, co-author with Jacques Bergier, a big book in the early 1960s called *The Morning of the Magicians*. That was like the first book to popularize kind of the occult and magic and mysticism and link it up with contemporary science, and it kick-started what was known as the occult revival of the 1960s. So if you're old enough to remember the 1960s, magic and mysticism and all that kind of stuff was very, very popular. And that starts with this book that Louis Paul had written, and he came to some of these meetings as well. So this is what's happening in Paris. We're getting, okay, a little bit more. We're almost getting close to the end here. Meanwhile, Ouspensky, like Aldous Huxley, Christopher Isherwood, Gerald Hurd, and others, realizes, well, he doesn't have to realize, the Blitz is happening. He's in London, he's outside of London, Virginia Water. They can see from Virginia Water the fires on the London docks and things of that sort. So the Blitz is happening. He's already lived through World War I, collapse of Civil War, all that. And he feels sure that either Hitler or Stalin is going to take over. He thinks the Western democracies are just going to cave in. They're not going to be able to stop either one of those. So he basically hightails it out of London. And he goes to New York, where he lives in a small flat and has, kind of private classes there. But he starts another kind of institute in a place in New Jersey called Mendham. And it's a farm, basically, called Franklin Farms. And again, I visited it in 1985, ages ago. When I was in the work, a friend of mine in it, his parents grew up in it, and they were Ouspensky students at this place in New Jersey in the 1940s. And I mentioned Rodney Collin. He and his wife become Ouspensky's staunchest, most devoted followers. But something's gone wrong at this point. Something's gone wrong. Ouspensky starts on the road to basically becoming an alcoholic, sadly. He's staying up late at night. His wife, Madame Ouspensky, she's more or less running the roost here. She's kind of a Gurdjieff in herself. She was sort of a terror. She had this, her thing was kind of, where Gurdjieff would point out who you are, your personality, she would kind of see your false personality. And she would sort of like tell you you think you're this, you're that, that kind of thing, and kind of show you, this is what she said she was doing, show you who you are, and so what you needed to work on yourself. But it lacked kind of, Gurdjieff had a certain warmth and a certain, again, he had that kind of presence. And there's many accounts of Madame Ouspensky being a bit of a shrew, put it that way. Ouspensky was actually quite a gentle, poetic, character, withdrawn, introverted. I think he made a mistake when he decided to set himself up as a teacher. Myself, I think he should have continued writing his books and all that, and incorporating what he had learned from Gurdjieff into other things. But who knows? Maybe in the next recurrence, which we'll get on to. But they're with him in Franklin Farms, and I have to do this again. Sorry. Also, there is J.G. Bennett, who goes through one of these evenings with Ouspensky where they get through a few bottles of Montrachet, which is a nice white wine. If you ever like white wine, it's a nice white wine. Ouspensky liked. And Bennett said at the end of one of these evenings, these marathon drinking sessions, he had an out-of-the-body experience. But I suspect if you get through several bottles of that, that might not be too surprising. But another fellow who was there was a fellow named Robert Durop, up at the top there. And he was quite well known in the 60s and 70s because he wrote a book called Drugs in the Mind, and another book called The Master Game. and Warrior's Way. Warrior's Way is about his account of his own spiritual search and the time he spent with Ouspensky in England here, and then he met Gurdjieff in New York. But he got tired of all the drinking, and he's kind of a Whole Foods, health conscious fellow. He set up a kind of commune in California, I think in the 70s and the 80s. So he kind of dropped out. He said it was too much drinking. And anyway, Ouspensky had lost it by this time. He felt. He said he didn't have any control what was happening. He was pining for lost St. Petersburg. And again, he's a Russian, so the Russians are nostalgic, just on principle. But also his Madame Ouspensky was running things and he wasn't. So he said this is whatever octave you were working on, it's come to an end here. And sadly, that's what's happened. Ouspensky is getting more and more ill in New York. He's starting, there's evidence to suggest that he felt he was being held there in some way, that he wasn't able to get away. And he decides, once the war is over, he decides to go back to England. So he decides to wrap up everything in New York and return to England. And the England he was returning to, if you know your history, is one of the worst places on the planet. Gurdjieff once said that the Earth was in a very bad place in the universe. That's why everything is very difficult here. Well, one of the worst places on the planet to go to at the time was London after the Blitz and everything. Food rationing, it's in ruins. So you've seen all the movies, you've seen the photos, so you know what it's like. But he decides to go back, and there's a place, Collett House, which is over South Canada. It's Barron's Court over that way. Here's a plaque that's on the building there. He starts holding classes there. He's worked there before he left America, but he goes and he holds a famous series of lectures in which you talk about shock. Well, he creates the biggest shock you could think of, because he says it's the end of the system. I've given up the system. It doesn't work, more or less. He's very ill. He can barely talk. He can barely walk. He's in a wheelchair and things of that sort. But he has these meetings, and people are asking him, "What should we do, Mr.?" He said, "You must learn to think for yourselves. Why did you think you were machines? Why did you think you were asleep? Who told you that? Why did you believe them?" So it's a complete kind of reversal. And he himself basically said, I devoted myself to a system that doesn't work. So depending on your point of view, yes, the way you taught it, it wasn't the right way to teach it. Gurdjieff said, "You must come back and learn from me," and you learn again. Or I think my own thing is, I think he made a mistake in teaching Gurdjieff's system for all these years and giving up the writing. At the end of his life, he didn't want his masterpiece, In Search of the Miraculous, to be published. It was only after he died that his wife and his publishers were able to bring it out. But just before, in his last days, I said Ouspensky had this fascination, this pet theory of eternal recurrence. It's in history. Nietzsche's written about it, Pythagoras and others. You can find it in different places. But he did write a novel about it called Strange Life of Ivan the Sokin. And the novel is about a young man who, after a series of catastrophes in his life and big mistakes and problems, he decides to commit suicide. And just before he does, he meets a magician. And the magician convinces him that he could send him back in time, But he says, it won't matter, because you go back, you'll do the same thing anyway. But he says, I'll take my chances. So he's sent back. And the novel is about him going back. And no matter what he does, inevitably, the same sorts of things happen that lead him, to where he was, wanting to commit suicide. But he rewrote it. And at the end, he sort of, this magician kind of, in a new, slightly different ending, the magician kind of tells him, I told you, but here, there's a way to not have that happen. So it's kind of like slightly coded for Gurdjieff there. But in his last days, the story is that in order to remember the next time he recurred, the next time he was back in this life, Ouspensky was taken around to all the places in England that he knew, that he liked, and being driven there. And he would stand in front of some, whatever house he knew, or whatever, some place, some location that he knew. And he became quite good friends with this fellow Maurice Nicoll, as I said, too. He became a student. Then Nicoll was one of the few people who actually became friends with Ouspensky. Ouspensky was a hard person to become friends with. And he had stayed with him at a cottage like out in Surrey, I forget exactly where it was. So he'd be taken there. And he'd be there trying to impress on his mind, his consciousness, these places. So the next time around, he would remember. But we're not sure whether this was Ouspensky's idea or whether Rodney Collin thought you need to do this, you have to do this so that you can get off the wheel. And Collin himself, after Ouspensky died, here's his gravestone out in Virginia, Line Place in Virginia Water, which I've gone to. That's my own photograph of it. He said after Ouspensky died, well, what he did, Collin he went into Ouspensky's room in Line Place where he lived. He locked the door. He wouldn't let anybody in. He was in there for a week. Didn't eat, didn't shave, didn't bathe, anything like that. He said he was in telepathic communication with Ouspensky, and he was giving him directions on how to carry on the work. And apparently there was all this other kind of paranormal stuff happening around. Visitation, strange sounds, strange feelings, things of this sort. So the idea was that somehow, having done this work and going back to see these places and pressing on his memory, Ouspensky now had somehow broken off the wheel of recurrence. We don't know for sure, but this was the idea. So this is 1947, Ouspensky passes away. Gurdjieff is still alive in London, in Paris. Many of Ouspensky's students cross the channel and go there. J.G. Bennett's one of them, Kenneth Walker, who wrote some of the most readable introductions to Gurdjieff and Ouspensky's ideas. There's a book called Venture with Ideas. And I think this one just called A Study of Gurdjieff's Teachings. They're very, very readable. Give you the basic ideas of that. But in Gurdjieff's last year, this is a picture of his pantry. So I'm saying people would come where he lived. It was almost like he lived in a delicatessen. And also like a junk shop, because where he lived in Paris, now it's a very fashionable, very expensive area, but back then it wasn't. There were a lot of poor people living there, and he used to buy these paintings or these kind of little art pieces that his neighbors made, just in order to give them some money so they would be able to buy food. And so he collected all this stuff. So it's like all this tchotchkes and bric-a-brac in this tiny flat, plus all this food. So it peppers and chili peppers and a variety of other things, so the smell radiating out. And then he would gather all these people. And at this time, he would be getting together about like 50, 60 people into a tiny, tiny dining room. And they would be knocking back this meal and the vodkas, and he would be, seeing them. And Idiots in Paris is J.G. Bennett's account of those things. And one of the things they did, the famous things that Gurdjieff did, was they would just drive in the car somewhere until it ran out of gas, ran out of petrol. And then he would say, all right, it's out of petrol. What should we do? And you'd have what do we do now? And he'd just be sitting in the car and letting, okay, we have to deal with this now. So this is like one of the famous kind of rides there. And he dies. And again, the story is that when the doctors did an autopsy on him, his inner organs were completely corrupt, completely kind of, gone. And they said this man should have been dead years ago. So somehow he had kept himself alive through sheer will. And he was mourned in Avon. The people coming to see, for the funeral were many. And the woman who carried on his work, Jean de Salzmann, who was Alexander de Salzmann's the fellow I said in Paris, his wife, and she became sort of the head of what became the Gurdjieff Foundation in the 1950s, and she taught the movement. So she lived to be about 101. I forget exactly what year she passed away. But today, here we're at the end, and it's still going on. This is we're the International Gurdjieff Foundation. They have offices and headquarters in different cities. I know here in London, there's one. And they keep a low profile. They don't advertise. You sort of have to, they're not hidden, they're not a secret society, but you sort of have to find your way to them rather than they're not advertising. Although there was a time in the 1980s, 90s, where there was this group called the Gurdjieff and Ouspensky Center, and they came to be known as the people of the bookmark. Because if you went into the bookshops and you opened up any fourth way books, their bookmarks would be in it. And it would be they were a bogus Gurdjieff group, and then they were advertising for themselves. But it's kind of a lot of Gurdjieff's ideas, especially the Enneagram, have kind of become part of just general mind, body, spirit material. So Marianne Williamson has put out an edition of In Search of the Miraculous, which she's kind of incorporated, I guess her own take on it. And this is just general, the Enneagram Global Summit. So it's become kind of a currency of the New Age. And this is Gurdjieff's gravestone, this dolmen. So there we are. Thank you for your patience and sticking with me. Thank you.